Hello, dear hearts. Welcome to Connecting to Consciousness, where the focus is to explore, to question, and examine our perspectives. I'm Nasira Waters. Many times when we think about boundaries, our initial thought may be setting clear expectations and limits that support our well being and nurture meaningful relationships. And of course, that's crucial. However, what I'm referring to is what boundaries do you practice with yourself? Again, what boundaries do you practice with yourself? Now, this is crucial in that when we are on our journey of curious self discovery, it is virtually impossible for us to show up as the best version of ourselves without practicing boundaries with ourselves. Now, practicing these boundaries supports the process of avoiding self sabotage, also of causing our own demise, and dishonoring oneself, of course, right? And so, this whole thought process around setting boundaries with oneself is important in that it requires us to be observant of our patterns, of our behavioral patterns, of our patterns of thinking, our emotional patterns, our physical patterns, our internal compass, the patterns that exist in us spiritually. This is important. And so we have to be observant, and it's important for us to monitor and self-regulate. Again, monitor and self-regulate our mental patterns, emotional patterns, our physical patterns, and our spiritual patterns. Now, in order for us to engage in monitoring and self-regulating, we do that in order for us to show up as the best versions of ourselves, right? So, as we do that, these are the things that I invite you to consider. One, consider, who are you engaging with? What are you engaging with? If we are not taking the time to examine how we are engaging in the world and with people, then it'll be very difficult to set boundaries around those things where we need to. So, what people are you engaging with? What is their character? Are you clear about their character? What are you consuming? What are you consuming with your eyes, with your ears? What media in all forms do you consume? What programs, television programs, whichever type of programs, are you consuming? Where do you frequent? Meaning, where do you go that you are taking in information that, whether you realize it or not, is impacting your perception about yourself, about people, about the world? And what ideas, perspectives, and perceptions do you express verbally? Are you engaging in gossip? Are you being judgmental? Whatever the situation is, it's important that we set boundaries around them. Now, I just want to clarify because it's my understanding that many people have various definitions of gossip. And so for this purpose, gossip is discussing someone else with others, discussing their situation, their circumstance, whatever it is about them that has nothing to do with you. So that is how we're looking at gossip. Now, again, it doesn't have to be gossip, but I use gossip because We are in a time and space where it's become somewhat normalized to engage in gossip. And people just say, oh, it's a little gossip. That to me is a bit alarming, because that tells me that we don't realize what these things are doing to us internally and how it impacts the individual and our relationship with them. So there's a level of unconsciousness there that is important for us to be aware of. So that's just one example. But each of us are called to look at whatever areas that we show up in that don't serve our greatest good and doesn't serve others' greatest good. And so we look at that and we ask ourselves, okay, how do I begin to monitor and self-regulate? And so some of the things we can consider is, before we consider that as those things, actually, let's be mindful that as humans, we like to see and view ourselves in the best light. And of course, that's wonderful. However, we are complex beings, and we often show up in various ways that don't serve our greatest good. And again, nor does it serve the greatest good of others. And so going through this process, it's important to be clear about the areas in which we need to set boundaries with ourselves. And so in order to do that, we need to identify those areas, those behaviors, those ways of thinking, and not only the behaviors, but the ways of thinking around those behaviors. Why am I thinking in this way? Why do I have this perspective? How is this perspective serving me? Because one of the things that I've learned is that humans do not engage in behaviors that don't serve them. Now, that may seem foreign to some, but if we really examined our thinking and our behaviors and analyze them and question them, we would come to see that we do not engage in behaviors that don't serve us in some way, shape, or form. And so as we are looking at our patterns of thinking, our emotional patterns, our physical and spiritual patterns, it's important that we ask ourselves, what are we thinking? What is causing us to think in the way that we do? Where is it coming from? Where within us is it coming from, and why is it showing up? Then we can ask ourselves, in what situations are we most likely to show up less than the best versions of ourselves? Is it around certain situations, certain people? Now, I say this not to say that this has anything to do with others, because it actually doesn't. It has everything to do with us as an individual. But to pinpoint it so that we can start to consider how we're going to address it, so that we can work on some strategies and some tools that would support the process of us showing up as better versions of ourselves, right? So if I know that I am going to be in a situation where it is likely that in that space gossip will take place, then one, I can upfront consider, do I need to be in that space? And if I make the choice to insert myself in that space, then what am I going to do if and when someone presents gossip? Am I going to engage? How am I going to support boundaries for myself, with myself, to ensure that I am not engaging in gossip. Again, I'm using gossip as an example because it has unfortunately seemed to become normalized in this culture that we currently live in. And so I can say, well, I'm going to be quiet. Now, one might say, well, that still means that you are complicit. The reality is that everyone has to take the necessary steps for them until they can gain enough courage to take the next step. So the first step is possibly I will be silent when I hear gossip so that I do not start to engage. I can also just excuse myself, respectfully excuse myself. There are many options. The key is for us to identify our behaviors that require us to set boundaries with ourselves so that we can show up as the best version of ourselves. So, if you are inclined to take this journey of setting boundaries with yourself, I invite you. Let's take the journey together. Until next time, live consciously.